Imagine you're the President of the United States. You're in the Oval Office staring at a wall-sized map of the world, and suddenly you realize something that makes your blood run cold. Your biggest rivals are moving faster than you. The Arctic ice is disappearing before your eyes. And sitting right there in your strategic backyard is a massive blind spot, an island larger than Alaska sitting between you and your adversaries. So what do? You do what any ambitious superpower would do. You pick up the phone, call Denmark's Prime Minister, and ask one simple question: how much? When Donald Trump publicly floated the idea of buying Greenland back in 2019, the entire world erupted in laughter. Late-night comedians had a field day. Social media exploded with memes. Denmark's Prime Minister called the suggestion absurd. The New York Times ran headlines treating it like a bizarre fever dream from a reality TV president. But here's what almost everyone missed while they were busy laughing. Trump wasn't joking. And more importantly, he wasn't the first. He was actually the third American president to seriously pursue acquiring Greenland. The United States has been obsessing over this frozen island for over 150 years. From internal studies after purchasing Alaska in the 1860s, to a formal $100 million gold offer in 1946, to covert nuclear missile bases carved into glaciers during the Cold War. And now, in January 2026, it's happening again. But this time it's not just talk. The White House has openly stated that using military force to acquire Greenland is among the options being considered. European allies are scrambling. NATO is facing its biggest internal crisis in decades. And the world is asking, has America lost its mind? The answer is more terrifying than you think. Because this isn't about ego. It's not about expanding territory for the sake of it. This is about minerals that power your smartphone. It's about military positioning in a warming Arctic. It's about controlling the ocean passages that will define 21st century trade. And it's about preventing China from getting there first. Today we're diving deep into the biggest real estate deal that never happened, and why it might actually happen this time. Welcome to the Arctic Cold War 2.0. Let's rewind the clock and get one thing absolutely straight. The idea of America buying Greenland didn't spontaneously materialize in a 2019 tweet. If you want to truly understand why the United States remains fixated on this island, you need to travel back to an era when ambitious men in top hats treated buying entire territories like shopping for antique furniture. The year is 1867. The American Civil War has just ended. The nation is stitching itself back together. And Secretary of State William Seward, the same visionary who just purchased Alaska from Russia, is staring at maps of the North Atlantic with hungry eyes. Critics had mocked him mercilessly for the Alaska purchase, calling it Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. They said he'd wasted $7.2 million on a frozen wasteland. But Seward knew something they didn't. He understood that geographic positioning was everything. Control the right territories and you control trade routes, resources, and military leverage for generations. So while the ink was still drying on the Alaska Treaty, Seward quietly commissioned internal State Department studies exploring the acquisition of not just Greenland, but also Iceland. His logic was ruthlessly strategic. Dominate the key North Atlantic choke points, control critical shipping lanes, and project American power deep into Arctic waters. It was 19th century empire building at its finest. But domestic political chaos and post-war reconstruction eventually buried these ambitious plans. The seed, however, had been planted in the American strategic consciousness. Fast forward to 1946. World War II has just ended, but the celebration is short-lived. Europe lies in ruins. The Soviet Union is rising from the ashes as a nuclear-armed superpower. And President Harry Truman realizes something chilling. The next war won't be fought in muddy trenches or across ocean beaches. It will be fought in the stratosphere with long-range bombers screaming over the Arctic Circle toward American cities. Greenland sits directly on that polar flight path. If Soviet bombers launched from their northern bases, Greenland would be the interception point, the last line of defense before those bombers reached New York, Washington, or Chicago. So Truman did something extraordinary. He made Denmark a formal offer, $100 million in gold. Not paper currency. Not government bonds. Actual gold bullion, gleaming and tangible. At the time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't mince words in their classified reports. They described Greenland as indispensable to the safety of the United States. If hostile aircraft crossed the polar route, Greenland-based radar and interceptors were the only realistic defense. Without it, American cities would be dangerously exposed to atomic annihilation. Denmark, recovering from Nazi occupation and determined to maintain its remaining territories, politely but firmly declined. But here's the crucial part. America didn't walk away. They adapted their strategy. If they couldn't buy the house, they'd rent the most important rooms forever. In 1951, the United States and Denmark signed a pivotal defense agreement granting America permanent military access to Greenland. The U.S. established what would become Thule Air Base, now Patuxent Space Base, positioning radar systems, early warning infrastructure, and military personnel on Greenland's northwestern coast. That strategic foothold exists to this day, quietly monitoring the skies for missile launches. So when headlines exploded in 2019 with Trump's purchase proposal, career military strategists and defense analysts weren't laughing. They were nodding knowingly. This was simply the latest chapter in a long-running strategic obsession. And here's one more crucial historical detail that most people forget. Denmark has actually sold territory to the United States before. In 1917, America purchased the Danish West Indies for $25 million in gold, territory we now know as the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the precedent for Danish-American territorial transfers isn't theoretical. It's historical fact. The obsession never ended. It just went quiet for a while. Now let's put on our admiral hats for a moment. If you pull out a standard classroom wall map, Greenland looks like a distorted, oversized blob drifting awkwardly at the top of the world. It seems remote, irrelevant, and frankly boring. But if you look at a proper globe, or better yet, a naval strategy chart used by military planners, you see something entirely different. You see what defense analysts call the GIUK Gap. And once you understand the GIUK Gap, you understand why Greenland is priceless. GIUK stands for Greenland Iceland United Kingdom. It's one of the most strategically vital naval choke points on planet Earth, yet almost nobody outside military circles talks about it. Here's why it matters. Envision yourself as a Russian submarine captain. Your mission is to get a nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine from your Arctic naval bases near Murmansk into the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean, where it can threaten the entire eastern seaboard of North America. In most practical scenarios, you have exactly one realistic path. You must squeeze through the GIUK Gap, passing between Greenland and Iceland or between Iceland and the United Kingdom. For NATO, this corridor functions as a monitored kill zone. It's covered by sophisticated underwater sensor networks, patrol aircraft flying continuous missions, surveillance satellites, and decades of accumulated acoustic data mapping submarine signatures. If you control Greenland, you control the western gate of that corridor. You own the high ground. If Greenland ever fell under hostile influence, say through massive Chinese infrastructure investments in dual-use ports or airfields that could accommodate military aircraft, that strategic gate becomes exponentially harder to secure. This is where the concept of the unsinkable aircraft carrier comes into play. You can sink ships. You can disable aircraft carriers with missiles or torpedoes. But you cannot sink an island. Greenland offers permanent forward basing for radar installations, long-range patrol aircraft, sensor arrays, and early warning systems sitting directly between North America, Europe, and Russia. In military strategy, there's a fundamental equation. Distance equals reaction time, and reaction time saves lives. A ballistic missile launched from Moscow travels roughly 5,000 miles to reach Washington, D.C. But from northern Greenland to Moscow, the distance shrinks to barely 2,000 miles. Geography compresses warning times and amplifies strategic leverage. And here's why this matters more than ever. Russian submarines have become quieter, more capable, and more persistent than at any point since the Cold War. NATO naval commanders openly admit they're playing a new, more dangerous underwater chess game in Arctic and North Atlantic waters. Now visualize this, if the United States actually owned Greenland outright. No diplomatic friction over expanding runways. No lengthy negotiations for deploying new sensor systems. No political delays when upgrading missile tracking infrastructure. It becomes sovereign American territory, a permanently hardened forward defense zone in the Arctic. But here's where it gets complicated, and why China enters this story. Greenland today is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, with its own parliament and a growing independence movement. Its population sits at just over 56,000 people, smaller than most NFL stadiums. An independent Greenland would immediately face crushing financial pressure, as it currently relies on Danish subsidies for more than half its government budget. And when small, resource-rich countries need infrastructure investments, there's one country that specializes in writing very large checks with very few political conditions attached: China. We've seen this exact playbook executed across the developing world. Sri Lanka's port lease in Hambantota. Pakistan's Gwadar port. China's first overseas military base in Djibouti. Infrastructure financing becomes strategic leverage. A friendly port agreement becomes a logistics hub. A logistics hub becomes a dual-use facility. And suddenly, China has operational influence in a region where the United States desperately needs exclusive access. U.S. defense planners are deeply concerned about a future Polar Silk Road scenario where China gains influence in Greenland not through outright purchase but through debt financing, port development, airport construction, and logistics access. If that happens, the GIUK Gap becomes far more difficult to secure. So when Trump bluntly said, "Buy it," the delivery was clumsy and the diplomacy was terrible. But the underlying geopolitical logic wasn't crazy. It was a ham-fisted attempt to preemptively block long-term strategic encroachment in the Arctic by America's only peer competitor. And China's interest isn't only about shipping lanes and submarine corridors. It's also about what's buried beneath that ice. Which brings us to the real prize. Let's talk money. If you're wondering why a real estate developer turned president would obsess over a frozen island, look no further than your smartphone. Or your electric car. Or the guidance system inside a modern cruise missile. Or the wind turbines generating renewable energy across America. All of these technologies share something critical in common. They absolutely require rare earth elements. And Greenland isn't just ice and rock. It's a massive strategic materials vault, sitting mostly untapped beneath melting glaciers. As Arctic ice retreats due to climate change, geological surveys have confirmed enormous deposits of rare earth elements, particularly at a site called Kvanefjeld in southern Greenland. Industry experts and government geologists consider it one of the largest undeveloped rare earth deposits anywhere outside China. Now, the name rare earths is profoundly misleading. These elements aren't actually rare in the Earth's crust. They're just brutally difficult and environmentally toxic to separate, refine, and process into usable industrial materials. But modern technology is utterly dependent on them. High-performance magnets for electric motors. Guidance systems for precision weapons. Electric vehicle batteries. Radar systems. Satellites. Advanced wind turbines. Fighter jet components. Nuclear submarine systems. None of these exist at industrial scale without rare earth elements like neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, and terbium. Here's the strategic nightmare keeping Pentagon planners awake at night. China controls roughly 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Even when rare earths are mined in Australia, the United States, or other countries, they typically get shipped to China for refining because only China has built the sophisticated, large-scale processing infrastructure needed to turn raw ore into usable industrial material. If Beijing ever decided to restrict exports during a geopolitical crisis, which they've threatened before, large portions of Western manufacturing would grind to a halt. Defense contractors building advanced weapons systems would face immediate critical shortages. Greenland's rare earth reserves are estimated at approximately 1.5 million metric tons, rivaling those of the United States and far exceeding Canada's reserves. The Kvanefjeld deposit alone, according to company estimates, contains well over 1 billion tons of ore grading at roughly 1.1% total rare earth oxides, including critical heavy rare earths that are especially valuable for military applications. But here's the uncomfortable twist that makes this geopolitical thriller even more complex. While American politicians were publicly joking about buying Greenland, a Chinese company called Xinghe Resources quietly acquired a major ownership stake in the Australian firm holding development rights to Kvanefjeld. This gave China meaningful financial influence over one of the most strategically important rare earth projects on the planet. So buying Greenland, or at minimum preventing China from gaining economic control over its mineral wealth, isn't just about territorial expansion. It's about preventing the world's factory from controlling the raw materials of the next industrial era, the clean energy transition, and advanced defense systems. Washington doesn't look at Greenland and see ice. They see a critical supply chain vulnerability currently being written in Mandarin. They see the batteries for America's electric vehicle future. They see the magnets for next-generation wind turbines. And they see the strategic materials for hypersonic missiles and sixth-generation fighter jets. In that context, $1 trillion price tag doesn't sound insane. It sounds like an insurance policy against technological dependence on a strategic rival. If you think the US government treats Greenland like just another foreign territory, let me tell you a Cold War ghost story that sounds like science fiction but is absolutely real. In 1959, US Army Corps of Engineers personnel arrived in northwestern Greenland with smiles, scientific equipment, and polite explanations. They told Danish authorities they were building a harmless Arctic research station under the ice to study weather patterns and glacial dynamics. Just science. Nothing to worry about. What they actually built was something out of a James Bond movie. Camp Century was a small underground city carved directly into the Greenland ice sheet. It had heated living quarters, a hospital, a chapel, a movie theater, a library, and enough space to accommodate roughly 200 military personnel at peak capacity. The entire facility was powered by one of the first portable military nuclear reactors ever deployed, a prototype called PM-2A. The public story was scientific research. The real mission, still classified for years, was codenamed Project Iceworm. The plan was extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. The U.S. military envisioned carving thousands of miles of interconnected tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet to hide hundreds of nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. The missiles would be constantly relocated on underground rail systems, making them nearly impossible for Soviet surveillance satellites or spies to track or target. It was a mobile, hidden nuclear deterrent buried under thousands of feet of ice. It sounded brilliant on paper. There was just one catastrophic problem the engineers hadn't fully anticipated. Ice moves. Constantly. Glaciers aren't static blocks of frozen water. They're dynamic, flowing rivers of ice under immense pressure. Engineers drastically underestimated how aggressively the glacier would deform and crush the tunnels. Walls warped. Ceilings buckled. Maintenance became overwhelming. Even the reactor infrastructure began feeling the relentless pressure of moving ice compressing around it. By the mid-1960s, the Pentagon quietly admitted the concept was unworkable. Camp Century was permanently abandoned in 1967. The nuclear reactor core was carefully removed and transported back to the United States. But much of the facility's waste was simply left behind, buried beneath layers of ice that planners assumed would remain frozen indefinitely. That assumption is now seriously in doubt. Tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, PCB-contaminated materials, sewage and low-level radioactive residue remain entombed beneath the ice. As Arctic temperatures continue rising, climate scientists warn that portions of Camp Century could eventually thaw over the coming decades, potentially releasing contaminated meltwater into surrounding ecosystems. Today, America's presence in Greenland is far less secret but far more strategically central. The installation formerly known as Thule Air Base is now officially called Patuxent Space Base, the northernmost U.S. military installation on Earth. It hosts a powerful early warning radar operated by the 12th Space Warning Squadron, scanning the skies continuously for ballistic missile launches over polar routes. This radar is a critical pillar of America's missile defense architecture, providing irreplaceable early warning coverage over the Arctic approaches to North America. If access to this base were ever compromised, say through a hostile takeover or a collapse in U.S.-Danish relations, early warning coverage over the entire Arctic region would be significantly weakened. Ballistic missiles launched from Russia toward the United States would have far less detection time. Which is precisely why, from Washington's perspective, owning Greenland wouldn't just simplify diplomacy. It would permanently lock down one of the most strategically sensitive radar installations on the planet, eliminating any political risk of losing access during a future crisis. Here's the darkest, most twisted irony of the 21st century. Climate change is an environmental catastrophe for the planet, but it's a potential economic gold mine for global commerce. And nowhere is that paradox starker than in the Arctic. For thousands of years of human history, the Arctic Ocean was an impenetrable frozen wall. If you wanted to ship a container from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you had no choice but to take the long route, through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and up into Europe. That journey typically takes 30 to 40 days, covering roughly 11,000 nautical miles. But as Arctic sea ice retreats, a trend accelerating faster than climate models predicted, entirely new shipping routes are opening up. And these routes could reshape global trade as profoundly as the opening of the Suez and Panama Canals did generations ago. The most important emerging route is Russia's Northern Sea route, hugging the Siberian coastline. In peak summer conditions, it can shave 10 to 15 days off Asia-Europe shipping times, cutting transit by roughly 25 to 35%. For global shipping companies moving millions of containers annually, fuel savings alone translate into billions of dollars. In the future, an even more direct path, the transpolar sea route cutting straight across the central Arctic Ocean, may become viable as ice continues thinning. That route isn't commercially reliable yet, but maritime planners and shipping companies are already preparing contingency plans. There's also the Northwest Passage, threading through Canada's Arctic archipelago and past Greenland's coastal approaches, offering another potentially lucrative shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. Greenland sits strategically adjacent to all of these emerging sea lanes. Whoever builds the ports, refueling hubs, repair facilities, and search and rescue infrastructure nearby effectively becomes the logistical gatekeeper of the future Arctic economy. China has openly branded its vision for this future the Polar Silk Road. Chinese government documents explicitly frame Arctic shipping as a way to diversify trade routes and reduce dependence on vulnerable southern choke points like the Suez Canal, which can be blocked by accidents, geopolitical tensions, or military action. Russia already charges significant transit fees, escort costs, and mandatory navigation services for ships using its northern sea route. In essence, they're collecting tolls on their Arctic coastline. But here's the catch. Very little of this supporting infrastructure actually exists in Greenland today. There are few deep-water ports capable of handling large commercial vessels. Emergency facilities are minimal. Shipping services are virtually non-existent. Building it all requires massive capital investment, billions of dollars for modern ports, airports, communications infrastructure, and logistics hubs. If Denmark can't afford to build it and the United States doesn't step in, someone else will. And the country currently walking around the world with the biggest infrastructure checkbook happens to be China. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has demonstrated a willingness to finance massive infrastructure projects in developing countries, often in exchange for long-term access agreements, operational control, or debt-based leverage. Owning Greenland wouldn't give Washington legal control over international shipping lanes themselves. Those are governed by international maritime law. But it would grant enormous influence over the ports, logistics hubs, security footprint, and commercial flow that make those routes actually usable and safe. So when you hear about melting glaciers and disappearing ice sheets, don't just think about rising sea levels and endangered polar bears. Think about new shipping superhighways. Think about trillion-dollar trade routes. And think about a quiet geopolitical race to decide who gets to collect the tolls on tomorrow's global commerce. The ice is melting. The lanes are opening. And everyone's racing to own the gates. Now let's talk about the real 4D chess Washington is quietly playing. While the media focused on Trump literally buying Greenland like a Manhattan real estate deal, sophisticated policymakers were pursuing a far more subtle and potentially more effective strategy. I call it the independence trap. Here's the reality on the ground. Greenland already functions as a quasi-independent nation. It has its own language, Greenlandic, its own parliament, its own flag and cultural identity. It controls most domestic policy decisions. But its passport still says Denmark, and critical decisions about foreign policy and military defense are made 2,000 miles away in Copenhagen by Danish politicians. Opinion polls consistently show that a strong majority of Greenlanders support full independence in principle, often somewhere between 60% and 80% depending on how the question is asked. The dream of sovereignty is real and deeply felt, especially among younger generations eager to control their own destiny. But there's one crushing obstacle: money. Every year, Denmark sends Greenland a block grant of roughly 4 billion Danish kroner, approximately $600 million. That single financial transfer covers more than half of Greenland's entire public budget and represents roughly 1/5 of the territory's total GDP. That money pays for hospitals, schools, police, infrastructure maintenance, energy systems, telecommunications, and social services. Without it, Greenland's economy would contract sharply and immediately. Public services would collapse. Living standards would plummet. So here's the brutal economic truth that hangs over every independence discussion. Greenland cannot currently afford to be fully independent unless someone else replaces Denmark's money. And this is where American strategy shifts from buying land to buying influence. If Greenland eventually votes for independence, and many analysts believe that's inevitable within the next 10 to 20 years, the Danish subsidy would be phased out. The new Greenlandic government would urgently need replacement funding just to prevent economic collapse and maintain basic services. And suddenly, whoever steps in first with generous financing, infrastructure investment, and security guarantees becomes by far the most important partner in the country. Picture the United States making this offer. Congratulations on your independence. We'll help replace the Danish funding. $600 million annually is pocket change for the U.S. defense budget. We'll invest heavily in port infrastructure, airport modernization, and telecommunications. We'll guarantee your security and train your Coast Guard. In exchange, we want expanded permanent military access, preferential mining and investment rights, and you agree to restrict Chinese investments in sensitive sectors. Washington would effectively gain enormous strategic leverage, potentially greater than outright ownership, for a relatively modest annual cost. It's far cheaper than buying the territory, avoids the diplomatic catastrophe of forcing a sale, and gives Greenlanders the independence they want while tying them firmly into the American orbit. We're already seeing the early groundwork being laid. In 2020, the United States reopened a consulate in GIUK, Greenland's capital, for the first time since the 1950s. Alongside the diplomatic presence came a $12.1 million civilian aid package explicitly aimed at business development, education programs, and infrastructure planning. Denmark publicly welcomed the move with diplomatic pleasantries. But privately, Danish officials were clearly uneasy about Washington establishing a permanent diplomatic and financial foothold inside what had long been Copenhagen's exclusive backyard. It's the geopolitical equivalent of someone quietly whispering in your friend's ear, "You don't really need your old partner anymore. We can take care of you. We understand you better. We'll treat you better." But the risk cuts both ways. If the United States hesitates, plays too cautiously, or gets distracted by other priorities, China is ready with its own checkbook. And Beijing often offers fast financing with far fewer political conditions, no lectures about democracy or human rights, and no complicated parliamentary approval processes. A report on Greenlandic independence alternatives is expected by the end of 2026, and the majority of Greenlanders want independence when it becomes economically feasible. The clock is ticking. So the real race isn't simply to buy land. It's a race to become the preferred partner, protector, and patron of a future independent Greenland. And whoever wins that race wins the Arctic. Okay, let's indulge the fantasy for a moment. Let's say the diplomatic stars somehow align. Denmark agrees to negotiate. Greenland's population votes yes in a referendum. Congress appropriates funding. Lawyers draft the paperwork. What's the actual price tag? How do you value 836,000 square miles of ice, rock, rare earth minerals, and strategic dominance? When President Truman offered $100 million in 1946, that's roughly $1.6 billion in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. That's insultingly low. That's literally less than what Facebook paid for Instagram. It's less than what billionaires pay for professional sports franchises. When the story broke in 2019, financial analysts actually attempted to run serious valuations. Financial Times writers modeled different scenarios, factoring in estimated mineral wealth, strategic military value, comparable land sales, and potential future revenues. Some estimates push toward the $1 trillion range, yes, trillion with a T, depending on assumptions about rare earth mining potential and Arctic shipping revenues. But there's another way to approach this, the Alaska model. The United States bought Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million, about $129 million in today's money, or roughly 2 cents per acre. If you applied that same cost per acre logic to Greenland's 836,000 square miles, that's 535 million acres, the price would be comically low, around $10 billion. But obviously, real estate is about comparables, and the geopolitical market has heated up considerably since 1867. A more realistic analytical lens is to treat Greenland like a distressed sovereign asset with massive long-term upside potential. Using that framework, you could justify valuations anywhere from $200 billion to $500 billion even before fully accounting for mineral extraction revenues. To put that in perspective, $500 billion is roughly what the United States spends annually just servicing the interest on its national debt. It's comparable to the total cost of developing the F-35 fighter program over decades. It's less than Tesla's peak market capitalization. For the price of one Elon Musk company, the United States could theoretically secure permanent Arctic dominance for generations. But here's the catch that breaks every financial calculator. You're not just buying land. You're buying a society. When the United States purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917, we bought both the territory and the people living there. If Greenland became a U.S. territory today, its roughly 57,000 residents would gain territorial status at minimum, and likely a pathway to full U.S. citizenship, just like residents of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. They'd become entitled to federal services, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans benefits, educational grants, infrastructure funding, and social programs. And bringing Greenland's infrastructure up to modern American standards would cost astronomical sums. Greenland currently has no roads connecting its towns. You literally cannot drive from one settlement to another. Everything moves by helicopter, boat, or small aircraft. Building a modern transportation network, upgrading power generation, installing high-speed internet, modernizing ports and airports, and establishing healthcare facilities would cost trillions over decades. So the purchase price, even a massive $500 billion price tag, is just the down payment. The renovation costs would dwarf it. Supporters of acquisition argue the alternative scenario is worse. What's the cost of losing Arctic strategic dominance to China? What's the cost of remaining dependent on Beijing for the rare earth materials that power everything from smartphones to hypersonic missiles? What's the cost of letting Russia and China jointly dominate future Arctic shipping lanes? Framed that way, even $1 trillion total investment over 20 years doesn't sound insane. It sounds like cheap insurance against catastrophic strategic failure. But before anyone starts printing money or drafting treaties, there's one enormous factor that every spreadsheet and every strategic memo conveniently forgets: the people. Because while Washington, Copenhagen, and Beijing play chess with maps and satellites, the actual human beings living on the ice are facing a crisis that money can't easily fix. And that's where this story stops being a geopolitical thriller and starts becoming a tragedy. While superpowers play strategic games on maps, treating Greenland like a chessboard, the 57,000 people actually living there are fighting a very different kind of war. And honestly, this is the part of the story that should make everyone deeply uncomfortable. To understand why Greenland is so vulnerable to external pressure, you have to understand its wounds. And there are 3 deep scars that still haven't healed. In 1951, the Danish government launched a social engineering experiment that still haunts the nation. They removed 22 Inuit children from their families in Greenland. Some were orphans, many were not, and sent them to Denmark. The stated goal was to modernize them culturally. Teach them Danish. Erase their native language. Turn them into model Danish citizens who would eventually return to Greenland and help reshape society into something more European, more civilized. It was colonialism disguised as charity. Cultural genocide packaged as education. When these children eventually returned to Greenland years later, many no longer spoke their own language. They felt alien and isolated in their own communities. Their families didn't recognize them. They didn't recognize themselves. Several of these children struggled with addiction, depression, and psychological trauma. Many died young. Entire family lines were fractured, with ripple effects still felt today. In 2022, the Danish government formally apologized and offered financial compensation to survivors. But apologies don't erase generational trauma. They don't repair broken families. And they don't restore trust. The episode left a deep, lasting distrust of foreign powers, whether Danish or American, promising to help or modernize Greenland for its own good. If you walk through GIUK or visit smaller coastal settlements, you'll often see posters with a simple message: the call is free. No one is alone. They look like ordinary public service announcements. They're not advertising a phone plan. They're advertising suicide prevention hotlines. Greenland has one of the highest suicide rates in the world per capita, particularly among young men. The combination of long winter darkness lasting months, historical trauma from colonization, geographic isolation, rapid cultural change, limited mental health infrastructure, and economic uncertainty has created a quiet mental health crisis that touches nearly every family. When politicians in Washington casually talk about buying Greenland or when Chinese investors talk about mining contracts, they're not discussing empty real estate. They're talking about a population that is hurting, resilient, and deeply sensitive to being treated like a commodity to be bought and sold. For thousands of years, the Inuit hunter and the sled dog were inseparable partners. You couldn't survive the brutal Arctic without dogs. They weren't pets. They were survival itself: transportation, hunting companions, cultural identity. Today that ancient bond is breaking, and the reason is devastating: climate change. As sea ice forms later each year and melts earlier, traditional hunting seasons have collapsed in many regions. Hunters can't reach seal populations. Game migration patterns have shifted unpredictably. Without reliable hunting income, feeding large teams of sled dogs becomes financially impossible. Imported commercial dog food is prohibitively expensive in remote settlements where everything arrives by air or boat. Some hunters have been forced into heartbreaking decisions: euthanizing dogs they can no longer afford to support. Over the past 2 decades, Greenland's sled dog population has declined by an estimated 40 to 50%. It's not just a practical loss. It's a visceral symbol of a culture caught between two worlds: the old Arctic way of life fading away, and the promised new economy of mining wealth and shipping lanes still not fully materializing. These aren't abstract geopolitical concerns. These are real people watching their culture, their mental health, and their traditional way of life disintegrate in real time. And the saddest part? Most of the politicians and business leaders discussing Greenland's future have never set foot there. They've never met a Greenlandic hunter. They've never attended a community meeting in GIUK. They're making decisions about other people's lives from comfortable offices thousands of miles away. If you thought this story was just about an awkward 2019 tweet that faded into history, you haven't been paying attention. What started as diplomatic embarrassment has escalated into serious strategic brinkmanship that has Europe deeply alarmed. In early January 2026, literally just days ago, the White House confirmed that President Donald Trump and his national security team are actively exploring what they describe as a wide range of options for securing control over Greenland. And then they said the quiet part out loud. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, in a formal press briefing, stated explicitly that the use of military force is not off the table, and that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option for the commander-in-chief when it comes to Greenland. Let that sink in for a moment. A senior White House official publicly stated that America is considering using military force against a NATO ally to acquire territory in 2026. The reaction was swift and alarmed. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen immediately reaffirmed that Greenland is not for sale under any circumstances and that its sovereignty must be respected. Other European leaders, including officials from France, Germany, and Canada, issued public statements warning that any suggestion of using force to change Greenland's status would fundamentally undermine the entire post-World War II international order. NATO itself is facing what some analysts are calling its biggest internal crisis since the founding of the alliance. The idea that one NATO member would threaten military action against another NATO member's territory is unprecedented in the alliance's 75-year history. Now, to be clear about what's actually happening on the ground, the United States has not mobilized invasion forces. There are no amphibious assault ships steaming toward Greenland. Copenhagen has not consented to any transfer of sovereignty. This isn't an imminent military invasion. What has changed is the tone and the seriousness. This has moved from a sideshow curiosity to a declared national security priority backed by explicit threats of force. Some U.S. lawmakers have tried to frame the military rhetoric as negotiating pressure, a way to force Denmark to the bargaining table rather than a genuine threat of invasion. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for example, has emphasized that the administration's ultimate goal remains a diplomatic resolution, though notably he has refused to rule out military action entirely when pressed by reporters. But here's what's driving this escalation. Arctic competition with Russia and China has intensified dramatically. Russian military activity in the Arctic is at its highest level since the Cold War ended. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic Circle, and has invested heavily in polar research, icebreaker construction, and Arctic resource development. From the U.S. perspective, the strategic window is closing. If America doesn't secure dominant influence in Greenland soon, China or Russia might fill that vacuum through economic or diplomatic means. And once that happens, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. So we're watching a dramatic geopolitical escalation play out in real time, not a traditional armed conflict yet, but something potentially more dangerous. A superpower deciding that its strategic interests override international norms, allied relationships, and the sovereignty of a territory that's been under Danish control for over 3 centuries. Whether this evolves into actual military confrontation or eventually returns to normal diplomacy remains to be seen. But for the first time in generations, the rhetoric from Washington is unmistakably serious, explicitly threatening, and profoundly destabilizing for the entire Atlantic Alliance. The ice isn't just melting. The entire strategic architecture of the North Atlantic is cracking under pressure. So why does the United States want to buy Greenland? It's not because America needs more ice. It's not because anyone wants to destroy pristine Arctic wilderness. And it's not even really about territorial expansion for its own sake. It's because the map of power is fundamentally changing. For 500 years, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of global commerce and military power. For the last 50 years, attention shifted to the Pacific as China rose and Asia became the world's manufacturing hub. But for the next 50 years, maybe the next 100, the future will be decided in the North. The Arctic is no longer a frozen wasteland. It's becoming a new ocean, a new trading corridor, and a new battlefield. And Greenland sits at the absolute center of that transformation. Greenland is the cork in the bottle. It controls access to the GIUK Gap, the naval choke point between the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. It holds the rare earth minerals that power smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced weapon systems. It hosts the radar installations that provide early warning of ballistic missile launches. And it sits adjacent to the shipping lanes that will carry trillions of dollars of cargo once Arctic ice disappears. The United States looks at Greenland and sees a strategic shield, the ultimate defensive position protecting North American airspace, controlling naval access, and securing supply chains for critical technology. China looks at Greenland and sees a battery, a massive reservoir of the rare earth elements needed to power its manufacturing dominance and challenge American technological supremacy. Russia looks at Greenland and sees a vulnerability, a weak point in NATO defenses where economic pressure or political manipulation could fragment the Western alliance. Denmark looks at Greenland and sees a responsibility, a territory it has controlled for centuries but can no longer afford to adequately defend or develop. And the Greenlanders? They mostly just want stability, dignity, economic opportunity, and a future their children can survive in. They want to preserve their culture while gaining prosperity. They want independence without poverty. They want sovereignty without becoming a pawn in someone else's game. But that's the tragedy of Greenland's position. Small territories with massive strategic value rarely get to control their own fate. Throughout history, they become prizes fought over by empires, regardless of what their people actually want. The question isn't whether Greenland will become more valuable. That's already happening as the ice melts and new technologies demand its minerals. The real question is how the world handles that value. Will it be through diplomacy, negotiation, and respect for Greenlandic self-determination? Will it be through economic leverage, debt diplomacy, and infrastructure financing that trades sovereignty for development? Or will it ultimately be through coercion, threats, and force? Right now, in January 2026, all three paths remain open. And that uncertainty is what makes this so dangerous. The ice is melting. And as it disappears, it's revealing something more dangerous than frozen wastelands or hidden military bases. It's revealing the rawest form of great power competition, the willingness of nations to abandon norms, threaten allies, and claim territories they believe are too important to leave in someone else's hands. Greenland isn't just a story about real estate or resources or military bases. It's a preview of the 21st century itself, a century where climate change doesn't just create humanitarian crises, it creates strategic opportunities. Where melting ice doesn't just raise sea levels, it opens new empires. And where the rules-based international order built after World War II faces its greatest test. Because if the United States can credibly threaten military action against a NATO ally to acquire territory in 2026, what happens when China decides Taiwan is too strategically important to remain independent? What happens when Russia decides the Baltic states are too vulnerable to ignore? What happens when every major power decides that rules only apply when they're convenient? Greenland is where we find out if international law still matters, or if we've returned to an era where might makes right and the strong simply take what they want from the weak. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe to stay informed about the stories that actually matter, the ones mainstream media treats as jokes until it's too late to laugh. And if you want to understand how great powers have manipulated smaller nations throughout history, watch our upcoming video on the Monroe Doctrine, America's 200-year blueprint for dominating its hemisphere. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay warm out there because the new Cold War is heating up.